Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, a picture-perfect suburb where everyone seemed to know their neighbors. The Bever family blended into the community quietly. Their modest two-story home stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, tucked between neatly trimmed lawns and flower beds. It was the kind of place where people believed nothing bad could ever happen. But behind closed doors, there was a silence, a suffocating kind, that no one else could hear. David Bever was a tech-savvy father who worked long hours in IT. He was a man of routine, punctual and quiet, rarely seen outside except to mow the lawn. April, his wife, was the backbone of the household, juggling 7 children with an almost robotic efficiency. They rarely socialized, except for the occasional wave to a neighbor while unloading groceries. But this wasn't unusual. Privacy was part of their lifestyle. Robert, the oldest son at 18, was a recluse. He spent most of his time locked in his room, his face illuminated by the glow of a computer screen. His younger brother, 16-year-old Michael, followed closely in his footsteps. The two were inseparable, often seen whispering to each other at the dinner table, their words unintelligible, but their connection unbreakable. Neighbors occasionally noticed things that felt off. The windows of the Bever home were always tightly covered, even on the brightest days. The kids rarely played outside, and when they did, their laughter seemed muted, strained. One neighbor remembered seeing Robert burning something in the backyard late at night. It was probably just trash, they told themselves, but the image lingered, a flickering flame, and Robert staring into it motionless. April had started to notice Robert's growing withdrawal. He spent less time with the family, more time locked away. Late at night, she would hear the faint hum of his computer, the clicking of keys, constant, deliberate. She wanted to ask, to intervene, but there was always something stopping her. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was fear. On one particular evening, April was folding laundry in the living room. Through the thin walls, she heard Robert and Michael's muffled voices coming from upstairs. She strained to listen. The words were faint, but clear enough to send a chill down her spine. "They won't see it coming. We'll be famous." She froze. What could they possibly mean? For a moment, she debated whether to confront them, but a sharp cry from Autumn, her youngest at 2 years old, pulled her attention away. By the time she returned to the thought, the words had dissolved into the hum of the house. Life moved on. David remained oblivious, immersed in his work. April tried to convince herself she was overthinking. After all, Robert was just a teenager. Teenagers said strange things, but the unease gnawed at her, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Something wasn't right. One night, as April was tidying up Robert's room while he was out, she found a notebook tucked beneath his bed. The pages were filled with dark sketches, knives, blood, shadowy figures. At the bottom of one page were the words, "Everyone will remember us." She slammed the book shut, her hands trembling. Was this a joke, an outlet for teenage angst, or something far more sinister? The next morning, April hesitated before placing the notebook back where she found it. She told herself she would talk to David about it after dinner, but that conversation would never happen. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with its usual life, children riding bikes, sprinklers spraying arcs of water over freshly mown lawns. But inside the Bever home, the atmosphere was different. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Robert Bever sat in the darkened glow of his computer screen, the only light in his room casting eerie shadows across the walls. The faint hum of the fan filled the silence, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of keys as he meticulously typed out his thoughts. He was not like others, he told himself. He was destined for something greater, something unforgettable. In his mind, history would never overlook the name Robert Bever. Hours passed as Robert delved deeper into online forums, consumed by stories of violence and infamy. He idolized the figures he read about, men who had turned their darkest fantasies into reality. To him, they were pioneers, innovators. Each story emboldened his resolve, feeding the dark ambition growing within. He began to sketch out his own plans, diagrams of his home, lists of supplies, and chilling mantras like, "No survivors, no mistakes." Michael, meanwhile, lingered in the doorway, hesitant yet intrigued. He watched Robert with a mix of admiration and apprehension. "What are you doing?" he asked one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert turned, his expression calm but piercing. "Something that will make us legends," he replied. There was no hesitation, no doubt. It was as if he had rehearsed those words 100 times. Michael shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the notebook sprawled open on the desk. It was filled with crude illustrations, figures with weapons, pools of red, and a chilling phrase scrawled in bold letters. Remember their names. You don't have to do this, Michael murmured, his voice wavering. But Robert leaned closer, his tone firm and unwavering. This isn't just for me, it's for us. Don't you want to be remembered? Don't you want to matter? Michael didn't respond. Deep down, he craved validation, craved a purpose. For so long, he had lived in Robert's shadow, following his lead without question. And now, as Robert's words swirled in his mind, he began to feel the weight of a decision he wasn't ready to make. April noticed the growing closeness between her two eldest sons. They were always whispering, disappearing into Robert's room for hours at a time. It was more than typical teenage secrecy. It felt deliberate, calculated. One evening, as she passed their room, she heard muffled voices through the thin walls. She paused, pressing her ear against the door. Everything's set, Robert was saying. No one will see it coming. Michael's voice followed, shaky and uncertain. But what if something goes wrong? It won't, Robert snapped. We've planned this for too long. There's no turning back. April's heart raced as she stepped back, her mind scrambling for answers. What were they talking about? A prank? A rebellious scheme? She wanted to confront them, but the thought of accusing her sons without proof felt wrong. Instead, she resolved to keep a closer eye on them. In the following days, Robert's behavior grew bolder. He began sneaking out at night, carrying a large backpack. When April confronted him one morning, his answer was dismissive. I'm just going for walks, he said, avoiding her gaze. But the dark circles under his eyes and his curt tone left her uneasy. David, oblivious to the growing tension, remained focused on work. You worry too much, he told April one evening as they sat in the living room. They're just kids. Boys go through phases. But April couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. That night, as the rest of the house slept, she crept into Robert's room. The notebook lay open on his desk. She flipped through the pages, her breath catching with each violent drawing and cryptic note. One page in particular made her blood run cold, a diagram of their house, marked with red X's over each bedroom. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around to see Robert standing in the doorway, his eyes locked on hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a calmness that chilled her to the core, he said, You shouldn't be in here. April's hands trembled as she placed the notebook back on the desk. What is this, Robert? She asked, her voice barely audible. It's nothing, he replied, his tone flat. Just stories. But the look in his eyes told her otherwise. She stepped past him, her heart pounding as she left the room. That night, sleep eluded her. She knew she had to act, but how? And what if it was already too late? The house was quieter than usual that evening. April stood in the kitchen, her hands deep in soapy water, scrubbing at a stubborn stain on a plate. Her mind drifted, replaying the moment in Robert's room over and over. She had to talk to David. But how could she explain what she had seen without sounding irrational? What if it really was just a phase, like he always said? The aroma of baked chicken wafted through the house as she finished cleaning up. In the living room, David was on his laptop, typing away at another late-night project. His face was calm, focused, so different from the storm brewing upstairs. Crystal sat cross-legged on the floor, entertaining Christopher and Victoria with a puppet show she had made from socks. Their laughter echoed softly, filling the spaces that April's thoughts had left tense and empty. For a moment, everything seemed normal, almost peaceful. Dinner's ready, she called out. One by one, the children filed into the dining room. Robert and Michael were last, walking side by side, their steps in sync as though choreographed. Robert pulled out his chair, his expression unreadable. Michael's eyes darted nervously around the table. The family held hands as David said grace, his voice steady and warm. But April couldn't help glancing at Robert and Michael. Robert's grip on Michael's hand seemed tight, too tight. Michael flinched slightly but said nothing. April looked away, the words of the prayer dissolving into a haze. As the meal began, conversation flowed easily. Christopher proudly recounted a story about winning a game at school, and Crystal chimed in with playful teases. Even Daniel, usually reserved, joined in with a joke that made everyone laugh. But Robert and Michael stayed silent, their heads low, their forks moving methodically. April cleared her throat, forcing herself to speak. Robert, she began cautiously. What are your plans after graduation? He paused mid-chew, then looked up. His expression was calm, but his eyes seemed to pierce through her. I haven't decided yet, he said simply. His tone was devoid of emotion, flat and final. The room grew quiet for a moment before Crystal filled the void with another story. The rest of dinner passed uneventfully. April watched Robert and Michael retreat upstairs as soon as their plates were cleared. She stood at the base of the stairs, listening to their footsteps fade into their room. Her unease deepened, but she stayed rooted, unable to move. Later that night, Crystal knocked on April's bedroom door. "Mom," she whispered, peeking in, "can I talk to you?" April motioned for her to come in. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" she asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Crystal hesitated. "Robert and Michael, they've been acting weird lately, like really weird. I heard them talking the other night. It sounded bad." April's heart skipped a beat. "What did you hear?" Crystal wrung her hands. "I don't know exactly. Something about no one expecting it, and something about being remembered." April's stomach tightened. "Thank you for telling me, Crystal," she said, forcing a calm tone. "I'll talk to your dad about it." But she didn't. The conversation replayed in her mind as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. She wanted to believe that her sons were just going through a phase. She wanted to trust that nothing could ever shatter the fragile peace of their home. Upstairs, Robert sat cross-legged on his bed, a knife in one hand and a notebook in the other. Michael paced the room, his movements jittery and restless. "We'll do it tomorrow night," Robert said, his voice low but firm. "No more waiting." Michael stopped pacing, his face pale. "What if something goes wrong?" he whispered. "Nothing will go wrong," Robert replied sharply. "We've planned everything." Michael swallowed hard, nodding reluctantly, but the fear in his eyes lingered as he sat down across from Robert. Downstairs, the house grew silent again, as if holding its breath. The clock in the hallway struck midnight, its chime echoing softly through the Bever house. The neighborhood outside was cloaked in silence, every window dark, every street empty. Inside, however, the air was thick with anticipation. Upstairs, Robert and Michael stood in their room, their breathing steady but heavy with the weight of what was to come. "Are you ready?" Robert asked, his voice low and calm, as if he were preparing for an exam rather than what lay ahead. Michael hesitated, his hands trembling. "I guess," he murmured. Robert stepped closer, his piercing gaze locking onto Michael's. "No guessing. We do this now or we never do it. There's no turning back." Michael nodded, swallowing hard. He couldn't argue, couldn't resist. The grip Robert had on him was more than physical. It was a tether, invisible yet unbreakable. The two descended the stairs silently, their knives glinting faintly in the dim light. They moved like shadows, deliberate and precise. In the living room, David sat dozing in his recliner, the television still flickering with muted images. Robert motioned for Michael to follow him as he crept closer to their father. The first blow was swift, brutal. David jolted awake, his eyes wide with shock as he tried to process the pain and the sight of his eldest son standing over him, the knife in his hand. "Robert, why?" were his last words before the struggle ended. April's scream shattered the silence. She had rushed from the kitchen upon hearing the commotion, only to see her husband lying lifeless on the floor. "No!" she cried, backing away as Robert turned to face her. "Please, no!" Michael moved in hesitantly, his grip on the knife shaky. Robert glared at him. "Do it!" he barked. And so, Michael stepped forward. Upstairs, Crystal awoke to the sound of screams. She bolted upright, her heart racing. In the next room, Daniel was already on his feet, clutching his phone. "Stay here," he whispered to her. But Crystal didn't listen. Instead, she followed him as he crept toward the stairs. What they saw froze them in place. Blood, chaos, and their brothers in the middle of it all. "Run!" Crystal screamed, pulling Daniel back toward the hallway. The two raced to the nearest room, slamming the door shut and locking it behind them. Daniel fumbled with his phone, dialing 911 as quickly as his shaking hands allowed. "They're killing everyone," Daniel whispered frantically into the phone, tears streaming down his face. "My brothers, they're killing my family." Crystal pressed her ear against the door, listening for footsteps. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. On the other side of the house, Robert and Michael moved methodically from room to room. They found Christopher and Victoria huddled together in the corner of their bedroom, crying. Michael hesitated, but Robert didn't. "We have to finish this," he said coldly, stepping forward. Downstairs, Daniel's 911 call was still connected, the line open as muffled screams and cries played in the background. The dispatcher stayed on the line, urging him to stay quiet and find a place to hide, but there was no place safe. Crystal grabbed Autumn from her crib and ran toward the bathroom, her heart pounding. She locked the door, pressing herself and the baby against the cold tile wall. Outside, footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. She held her breath, her hand over Autumn's mouth to stifle her cries. "Crystal?" Robert's voice called from the hallway. "Come out! We know you're in there!" She didn't move, didn't respond. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Then, the doorknob rattled. "I'll handle it," Robert said. Suddenly, the sound of sirens pierced the night. The boys froze. "Cops!" Michael hissed, panic rising in his voice. Robert clenched his fists, his face a mask of anger and frustration. "We're not done yet," he snapped, but the urgency in his voice betrayed him. Crystal listened as the footsteps retreated down the hall, growing fainter. She waited, clutching Autumn tightly, until the house fell eerily quiet once more. The sirens grew louder, closer, until flashing red and blue lights illuminated the walls of the Bever home. The 911 dispatcher's voice was calm but firm, a lifeline in the chaos. "Stay on the line with me, Daniel," she urged, her words cutting through the static-filled connection. "Tell me where you are." Daniel's voice trembled, barely audible over the muffled screams in the background. "Upstairs, in the closet, please hurry, they're killing everyone." His breathing was ragged, shallow, the weight of terror pressing against his chest. The dispatcher tried to keep him talking, asking questions to gather as much information as possible, but his replies were clipped and panicked. He couldn't hear her over the pounding in his ears. Meanwhile, downstairs, Crystal cradled Autumn in the locked bathroom, every muscle in her body rigid with fear. She pressed her ear to the door, listening intently. The house was unnervingly silent. The distant wail of sirens began to cut through the stillness, faint at first but growing louder. Hope flickered in her chest, fragile and fleeting. The front yard of the Bever home lit up with flashes of red and blue as the first patrol car screeched to a halt. Officers stepped out cautiously, their hands on their weapons, scanning the scene. Through the open front door, they could see the lifeless form of David Bever sprawled in the living room, blood pooling beneath him. One officer raised his radio. "We have multiple victims," requesting immediate backup. Inside, Robert stood at the base of the stairs, his jaw clenched as he listened to the commotion outside. "They're here," he muttered to Michael, who was frozen in place, the knife trembling in his grip. "We need to go," Michael whispered, his voice cracking. But Robert didn't move. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, toward the rooms where the others were hiding. "Not yet." Upstairs, Daniel pressed himself against the closet wall, clutching the phone to his chest. The dispatcher's voice crackled in his ear. "They're coming to help you, Daniel. Just stay quiet." The sound of footsteps on the stairs made him squeeze his eyes shut. The floorboards creaked under Robert's weight as he ascended, each step deliberate, calculated. "Daniel," Robert called out, his voice eerily calm. "Come out, little brother. We just want to talk." Tears streamed down Daniel's face as he clutched the phone tighter. "Please, please," he whispered, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped just outside the closet door. Robert paused, his hand on the doorknob, listening. For a moment, all was still. Then the sound of heavy boots pounding up the front steps shattered the tension. A booming voice rang out. "Police, drop your weapons and come out with your hands up." Robert's head snapped toward the sound. He hesitated, then stepped back from the closet. "We're not done," he said under his breath before turning and retreating down the stairs. The officers entered the house cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They moved in formation, clearing each room methodically. "Victim here," one of them called out, kneeling beside April's lifeless body in the kitchen. The radio crackled as updates were relayed to incoming units. In the upstairs hallway, Crystal heard the officers' voices and felt a surge of relief. She unlocked the bathroom door and peeked out, clutching Autumn tightly. "We're here," she cried, her voice hoarse. A flashlight beam landed on her, and an officer rushed forward, guiding her and Autumn to safety. The officers continued their search, their movements swift but cautious. One of them found Daniel in the closet, still clutching the phone. He was pale, his eyes wide with terror, but alive. "You're safe now," the officer said, his voice soft but firm. Daniel broke into sobs, collapsing into the officer's arms. Downstairs, Robert and Michael had vanished. A quick search of the property revealed an open window in the back, the screen torn away. "They're on foot," an officer radioed in. "Search the perimeter." The dispatcher's voice echoed in the officers' radios. "Backup is en route. Suspects are considered armed and dangerous." In the living room, another officer uncovered something chilling, a stack of notebooks on the coffee table. He flipped one open, revealing detailed diagrams of the house, lists of weapons, and crude sketches of what appeared to be the family members. Scrawled across one page in bold letters were the words, "No survivors." The officer held up the notebook, his face grim. "This wasn't random," he said. "This was planned." Outside, more squad cars arrived, their lights illuminating the chaos. Crystal sat on the curb, wrapped in a blanket, her arms still clutching Autumn. Daniel was beside her, his head resting against her shoulder, tears streaking his face. The night was far from over. The forest behind the Bever house was dense, its tall trees forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Shadows danced on the undergrowth as Robert and Michael sprinted deeper into the darkness. The distant sound of sirens faded behind them, replaced by the rustle of leaves and their own ragged breaths. They didn't speak. There was no need. Each step carried the weight of everything they had done and what they still planned to do. Michael lagged slightly, his movements clumsy compared to Robert's focused strides. "We can't keep running," Michael panted, his voice shaky. "They're going to find us." Robert stopped abruptly, turning to face his younger brother. His eyes burned with frustration, but there was a hint of something else, fear. "We don't stop," Robert hissed. "Not until it's done." Michael's gaze dropped to the ground. "What if we just give up?" The words came out barely above a whisper, but they hung in the air like a challenge. Robert stepped closer, his expression darkening. "Give up?" he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "You think we've come this far just to quit?" Michael didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Robert shook his head in disgust. "You're weak," he spat. "Always have been." For a moment, the brothers stood frozen, their breaths visible in the cool night air. Then the sound of barking cut through the silence, sharp and urgent. Michael's eyes widened. "Dogs," he stammered. "They have dogs." "Move!" Robert barked, grabbing Michael by the arm and pulling him forward. The two plunged deeper into the woods, their pace frantic. The barking grew louder, closer, accompanied by the faint crackle of radios and the thud of boots on the forest floor. The officers were closing in. Thermal imaging devices scanned the trees, their screens glowing with the heat signatures of the fleeing brothers. "We've got movement north by northeast," an officer called into his radio. "2 subjects on foot." Robert led Michael toward a shallow creek, its icy water glinting faintly in the dark. "Get in," he ordered, stepping into the stream. The water soaked through their shoes and chilled them to the bone, but it masked their scent, buying them precious seconds. Michael hesitated at the edge, his chest heaving. "I can't," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I can't do this anymore." Robert whirled around, his frustration boiling over. "You don't have a choice," he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. "You're either with me or against me." Tears streamed down Michael's face as he stepped into the water. His movements were slow, reluctant, but he followed his brother upstream. The barking faded slightly, muffled by the sound of rushing water. For a brief moment, it seemed they had escaped. But then, a spotlight pierced through the trees, its beam cutting through the darkness and landing directly on them. "Freeze!" a voice commanded, firm and unyielding. "Put your hands where we can see them." Robert turned, his knife glinting in the light. "You're not taking me alive!" he screamed, his voice filled with defiance. He lunged forward, but the officers were faster. A loud crack echoed through the forest as a taser fired, dropping Robert to the ground. His body convulsed as the electric current coursed through him and the knife fell from his hand. Michael fell to his knees, his hands raised in surrender. "Don't hurt me," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "I didn't want to do it." The officers moved quickly, securing both brothers with handcuffs. Robert struggled against their grip, his fury undiminished. "You'll never understand," he spat. "This was supposed to be bigger than you, bigger than all of you." Michael remained silent, his head bowed, tears dripping onto the forest floor. The barking of the dogs grew fainter as the officers radioed in their capture. "Suspects apprehended," one officer reported, requesting transport. As Robert was dragged toward the waiting vehicles, he looked back at Michael, his expression a mixture of anger and disappointment. "You're nothing without me," he muttered. Michael didn't respond. For the first time that night, he felt the weight of what he had done and what he had allowed. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the edge of the forest, as the brothers were loaded into separate patrol cars. The night was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. The interrogation room was sterile and cold, its walls painted a pale gray that seemed to drain the life from anyone inside. Robert sat in a metal chair, his hands cuffed to the table, his expression calm, almost detached. Across from him, Detective Harris reviewed a stack of documents, the evidence gathered from the Bever home. "You think you're special, don't you?" Harris began, his voice steady, probing. "You think what you've done will make you immortal." Robert didn't respond, but a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Harris slammed a notebook onto the table. The pages splayed open to reveal detailed diagrams of the Bever house. Every room was labeled, red X's marking specific locations. "This isn't the work of someone impulsive," Harris continued. "This was calculated, cold, every detail planned. So tell me, Robert, why?" For the first time, Robert leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "You wouldn't understand. People like you never do." Harris met his gaze, unflinching. "Try me." Meanwhile, in a separate room, Michael sat slumped in his chair, his face pale and tear-streaked. Unlike Robert, he couldn't hold himself together. His hands trembled as he spoke to the young officer across from him. "I didn't want to," he muttered. "It was all him. He made me do it." "Made you," the officer pressed, "or did you choose to follow?" Michael shook his head violently. "No, you don't get it. He wouldn't let me stop. He said if I didn't help, he'd kill me too." In another part of the station, evidence technicians were sifting through the contents of the notebooks recovered from the Bever home. The pages were filled with chilling details, lists of potential future targets, locations mapped out in meticulous detail, and even a timeline of when and how the attacks would occur. At the bottom of one page, a phrase was scrawled in bold, erratic handwriting: "The Bever legacy." Crystal, still in her hospital bed, had been visited earlier that morning by detectives. Her testimony provided more pieces to the puzzle. "They were always together," she told them, her voice strained but determined. "Robert was the leader. Michael, he just followed. But they talked about it for months, how they'd start with us and then move on to everyone else." The detective shared a grim look. This wasn't just a family tragedy, it was a narrowly averted massacre. Harris returned to the interrogation room, a folder in hand. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Robert. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Robert glanced at it briefly. "Enlighten me." Harris opened the folder, revealing a photo of a neighbor's house. "You had them next," he said, pointing to the names listed beneath the address. "The Smiths, a family of 4, and after them, the elementary school 2 miles away." Robert's smirk faded. For the first time, he looked unsettled. Harris seized the moment. "You wanted to be famous, didn't you? A name everyone would remember. But here's the thing, you're not special, you're just another coward hiding behind a knife." Robert's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. In the adjacent room, Michael broke down completely. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he sobbed. "We were just supposed to scare people." The officer leaned closer, his tone softening. "But it didn't stop there, did it? And now you have to live with what you've done." Later that evening, as the evidence was compiled, detectives discovered a video recording on Robert's laptop. It was a manifesto of sorts, a chilling monologue filmed in his bedroom. "This is the beginning," Robert said in the video, his voice steady and unrepentant. "The world will remember the name Bever, not just today, but forever." Detective Harris watched the footage, his jaw tightening. "He wanted a legacy," he muttered to himself. "Well, he's got one." As the video ended, the screen went black, leaving only the sound of static. The weight of what could have been settled heavily over everyone in the room. The courtroom was packed, every seat occupied by reporters, grieving family friends, and curious onlookers drawn to the horrific details of the Bever case. The air was thick with tension, a palpable mix of anger, sorrow, and morbid fascination. At the center of it all sat Robert and Michael, separated by a team of guards, their shackles clinking softly as they adjusted in their seats. Robert sat upright, his face emotionless but focused. He scanned the room, his eyes meeting the stares of strangers, seemingly unfazed. Michael, on the other hand, hunched forward, his hands trembling as he avoided eye contact with everyone around him. The prosecution began by laying out the evidence: gruesome photographs of the crime scene, the notebook filled with plans, and the chilling video manifesto discovered on Robert's laptop. The room fell silent as the video was played, Robert's voice reverberating through the speakers. "This is the beginning," he said, staring directly into the camera. The Bever name will be remembered, not just for today, but for generations. This is our legacy. Several gasps rippled through the courtroom. A woman in the back began to cry softly, the sound quickly muffled as she tried to compose herself. Crystal was called to the stand. She walked hesitantly to the witness chair, her movements stiff as though carrying the weight of her family's loss. Her scars were visible, both physical and emotional, as she raised her right hand to be sworn in. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor said gently. "Crystal Bever," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The prosecutor guided her through the events of that night, her questions careful but probing. Crystal's voice trembled as she recounted the moment she realized her brothers were attacking their family. They weren't my brothers anymore," she said, tears streaming down her face. "They were monsters. I tried to save my little sister, to hide her, but they wouldn't stop." Her gaze shifted to Michael, who avoided her eyes. "Michael," she said directly, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you stop him?" Michael's shoulders sank under her words. "I was scared," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know what else to do." The prosecutor turned her attention back to Crystal. "And what do you want the court to understand about what happened?" Crystal straightened in her seat, her voice firm despite her tears. "That it wasn't just a crime. It was a betrayal. They destroyed our family, and no punishment will ever fix that." Robert smirked as she stepped down, his arrogance unshaken. The prosecutor took the opportunity to address him directly. "Mr. Bever, do you feel any remorse for what you've done?" Robert leaned forward, his voice cold and calculated. "Regret? No. It was necessary." The room erupted in murmurs, a wave of disbelief and anger washing over the crowd. The judge's gavel slammed down, restoring order. "One more outburst and I will clear this courtroom," she warned. The defense's turn came, attempting to portray Michael as a victim of manipulation. A psychologist testified, outlining how Robert had groomed his younger brother for years, preying on his insecurities and isolating him from the rest of the family. But the prosecution was relentless. "Michael Bever knew right from wrong," the prosecutor stated, her voice firm, "and he chose to stand beside his brother, even when he could have saved lives." The final testimony came from a family friend who had known the Bevers for years. She described April as a loving mother, David as a devoted father, and the younger children as bright and full of potential. "They didn't deserve this," she said, her voice breaking. "No one does." As the closing arguments were delivered, the weight of the trial settled heavily over everyone in the room. The judge called for a recess before the verdict, leaving the audience to sit in silence, digesting the horrors they had just witnessed. Crystal sat in the gallery, her hands gripping the edges of the bench as she stared at the back of her brothers' heads. She didn't look away, even as Robert was escorted out of the courtroom, his smirk still lingering. The house on Magnolia Court no longer stood. Where the Bever family home had once been, there was now an empty lot, the grass struggling to grow over a wound the community could never forget. A small memorial stood at the edge of the property, adorned with flowers, candles, and handwritten notes from strangers and friends alike. "Rest in peace" was etched into a simple wooden plaque, a stark contrast to the horrors that had unfolded there. Crystal stood before the memorial, her reflection distorted in the glass of a framed photograph of her parents and siblings. Her hand trembled as she placed a fresh bouquet of daisies among the offerings. "You deserved better," she whispered, her voice breaking. The sunlight caught the tears streaming down her face, glinting like shattered glass. Since the trial, Crystal had been living with relatives, trying to rebuild a life that felt irreparably broken. Each day was a battle between memory and survival. Every sound, every shadow seemed to carry echoes of that night. Therapy sessions brought some relief, but the questions always lingered. Could she have done more? Should she have seen the signs earlier? In the quiet of her new home, Crystal often found herself poring over old family albums. The images felt like relics from another life, birthday parties, camping trips, laughter frozen in time. She would trace her finger over the faces of her parents, remembering her mother's gentle voice and her father's unwavering patience. And then her gaze would inevitably land on Robert and Michael, their smiles now hollow, their presence tainted by betrayal. The community of Broken Arrow grappled with its own grief. Neighbors who had once waved to the Bever family from across the street now carried the weight of guilt. "We should have known," one said during a vigil, "but how could we? They seemed so normal." At local schools, counselors were brought in to help students process the tragedy, Teachers who had once taught the Bever children spoke of their bright futures, now extinguished. Christopher wanted to be an astronaut, one teacher said, her voice heavy with emotion. Victoria loved to draw. They had their whole lives ahead of them. The surviving siblings, Crystal and Autumn, became symbols of resilience in the face of unspeakable loss. Community members rallied to support them, raising funds and offering words of encouragement. But no amount of kindness could erase the scars. Michael, now serving his sentence in a juvenile facility, had written a letter to Crystal. It was brief, filled with apologies that felt both heartfelt and hollow. "I'm sorry," it read. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I regret everything. I was weak, and I let him control me. I hope you can find peace someday." Crystal folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him or herself. The pain was too raw, the wounds too fresh. Robert, on the other hand, remained unrepentant. In interviews with prison officials, he spoke of his actions with a chilling lack of remorse. "They made me who I am," he said once. "I was always destined for more. They were just obstacles." The media frenzy surrounding the case slowly faded, but the memories refused to dim. Crystal knew that the name Bever would always carry a shadow, a legacy she had no choice but to bear. But she was determined to rewrite that legacy, to honor the lives that had been taken. Standing at the memorial, she made a silent vow. "I'll live for them," she whispered, "for the ones who can't." Autumn, now 4 years old, tugged gently at Crystal's hand, her small voice breaking the heavy silence. "Can we go home, Crystal?" she asked, her eyes wide and innocent. Crystal nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, let's go home." She picked up her sister, holding her close as they walked away from the empty lot. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. But Crystal felt the faintest glimmer of hope, a promise of healing, even if it came slowly. The story of the Bever family became a grim touchstone for Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, a tragedy etched into the collective memory of the community and a stark reminder of the fragile seams holding families together. In the months following the trial, people struggled to make sense of what had happened. How had a seemingly ordinary family become the epicenter of such horror? How had no one seen it coming? Crystal, now the reluctant face of resilience, began speaking publicly, not to recount the horrors she endured, but to advocate for awareness. "There are always signs," she said during a vigil one evening. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of someone who had lived through unspeakable loss. "We ignore them because it's easier to believe everything is fine, but silence can be dangerous." Her words resonated deeply, sparking conversations that had long been avoided. Schools introduced programs focused on mental health and early intervention, while churches and community centers held workshops on recognizing warning signs of domestic unrest and emotional instability. At one such gathering, a psychologist, Dr. Karen Hayes, dissected the case with precision and care. "Robert displayed classic signs of a sociopath," she explained to the audience. "His lack of empathy, his need for control, and his fixation on infamy were not developed overnight. These traits likely emerged years ago, but were overlooked because of our reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths." But the lessons extended beyond psychology. Law enforcement officials used the case to emphasize the importance of vigilance within communities. "We can't rely on the idea that it could never happen here," a police captain stated during a town hall meeting. "It can happen anywhere, and it's our responsibility to act when something feels wrong." For Crystal, the lessons were deeply personal. She spoke candidly about the moments she wished she had pushed harder, when she'd seen Robert and Michael's secretive behavior, when she'd overheard their conversations. "I don't blame myself," she clarified, "but I've learned to trust my instincts, and I want others to trust theirs too." Michael's role in the tragedy became a controversial point of reflection. In his letters from prison, he expressed regret, claiming he had been manipulated by Robert. "I thought I had no choice," he wrote in one letter, "but I was wrong. I could have stopped it." Some saw Michael as a victim, a boy trapped under the influence of an older sibling with a dangerous mind. Others viewed him as an accomplice, someone who had the power to walk away but chose not to. Crystal herself remained conflicted. "I've read his letters," she admitted in an interview, "and I believe he's sorry, but forgiveness, it's not something I can give, not yet." For the community, healing came slowly. The memorial garden where the Beaver house once stood became a place of quiet reflection. Every week, fresh flowers appeared at the base of the wooden plaque, A local artist painted a mural on the side of a nearby building depicting a tree with 7 branches, 5 broken, 2 still standing. Beneath it, the words, "We remember," were written in soft, flowing script. As the years passed, the story of the Bever family was taught in criminal psychology courses and discussed in true crime documentaries. But for Crystal, it was never just a story. It was her life, her loss, her burden to carry. On what would have been Christopher's 12th birthday, she visited the garden with Autumn. The little girl, now old enough to ask questions, pointed to the plaque. "Who are they?" she asked innocently. Crystal knelt down, placing a hand on her sister's shoulder. "They're our family," she said softly, "and we'll never forget them." Autumn nodded, her small fingers brushing against the carved words. "I'll remember too," she promised. As they walked away, the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden. For Crystal, the road ahead was still uncertain, but she carried with her the hope that, through her pain, others might find the courage to speak up, to act, to prevent another tragedy from unfolding in silence. What do you think of Robert and Michael Bever? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below and rate the story from 0 to 10. We'd love to hear your perspective.